Hey everybody! In this video I'm going to show you how to draw a variety of different lip shapes. But let's get started with probably our most basic shape of lips, and that would be like the Cupid's bow, so those curvy standard lips. So usually when I start drawing lips, I start with kind of the simple shape of where the lips come together. So in this case, it's got kind of a nice curve to it. So the corners of the mouth kind of curve up, and there's a slight indent in the center of the mouth as well. The angles at which all of this happen vary drastically from person to person, and so this is just kind of a guideline to start with. From there, I'm going to just gently block in the curve of the lower lip. So for some people, the line here, this is called the vermilion border. It's a very fancy term for where the pink part of your lips are. So the vermilion border can end before the corners of the mouth, or it could go directly to the corners of the mouth. Depends on the person. So I'll line that up, and then the upper lip, again, varies drastically from person to person. This could be very thin, it could be thicker, they could be kind of the same width from top to bottom or different. And then the amount of angle here, so this is the actual Cupid's bow part that I'm drawing right now. This could be very angular, it could be very soft and curvy, it could even be straight across like this. So in typical Cupid's bow lips, they make a bow shape basically. So when we're doing a lot of drawing with shading and we want things to be realistic, I start with lines just to kind of explain the basic shapes that are created here, but generally I try to avoid hard outlines on things when I'm shading. That way it's going to look more realistic, because nothing on your face really is a line, so to speak. So what I'm going to do is just go ahead and start shading this. So when we're shading the mouth, we want to think about where things are overhanging and where things are kind of protruding. So probably the parts that stick out the furthest would be right here on the lower lip. That's going to stick out the furthest, and then right up here on the upper lip. So these are where we're going to see highlights because they are sticking out. Whereas the upper lip tends to, say if we're looking at this from the side, we would see the mouth kind of overhanging just a little bit. And that's going to cause a shadow, right? Whereas this sticks out more and this sticks out more. So the light would hit those areas. So let's just start shading then. Generally, when I am shading, I try to kind of follow along the curves of the mouth. So I'm going around these, they're sort of tube shaped. And that's going to help them look more round later. And notice how I'm using the side of my pencil. So I'm holding my pencil differently because that allows me to have kind of a softer edge as I am shading, so I don't have like a hard point to my pencil. This might feel weird to you at first, holding your pencil this way, but the more you do it, the more comfortable you'll get, and the more you'll start to realize that you have a lot of control once you practice with it. All right, now I'm going to go in with my blending stump and just kind of soften up these edges. So right now I'm working on some structures on the upper lip. And this divot right here in the center is called the philtrum. So that's kind of where we generally start to see shadows. And then we do see kind of like two highlights that appear up here, and those are called the philtral ridges. So we can kind of take an eraser and lighten those up just a little bit. You want to be careful that you don't overdo the shading on the philtrum and the sides of the upper lip, because if you do just a little too much, it's going to look like you have a mustache when you maybe don't. So just gentle shading. You can always use your eraser to lift off areas. And now that I have everything kind of blocked in with some simple shading, I'm going to start adding in a little more detail. So generally when we're shading on a lip that is a little more curved, where the upper and lower lips come together, we're going to see some darker shadows kind of in these uplift areas, because that's almost like your mouth is kind of opening a little bit there. And so you'll kind of get a little more shadow than you will under this protruding edge right here. And then generally we're going to get darker again towards the corners of the mouth. You want to be kind of gentle with your shading at this point. Don't overdo it right away, because it's always easier to go darker. It's not always easy to get lighter. So I find that usually the corners of the mouth, we're going to see some darker shadows on the lower lip at this point. And that's going to help kind of define the roundness of the lip. All right, so here we see just a basic sort of Cupid's bow style of lips. Let's move on to our second style. That would be upturned lips. So when we draw upturned lips, one of the key features is that the corners of the mouth, fun fact, they're called oral commissures, fancy terms, those corners tend to turn upwards, so it's almost like you're in a constant smile. So again, I'm going to focus on starting with that center curve. This may be flat across, this may be more curvy. Again, it just depends on who you're drawing. So we're noticing that these curves kind of go up a little higher in the corners. So we'll start here with the center, and then we will create kind of the basic shape of the bottom and top of the lips. So one thing I tend to notice when I look at lips that are more upturned is I find that the upper lip tends to stop before the corners of the mouth, and that is usually what tends to give the lips that curved shape at the edges. So we have kind of an extra curve along these lines. So it kind of gives you that permanent quirk of the mouth as you're looking at it. All right, so once we have these basic edges in place, then we can start shading again. So same concept goes as what I said in the last one. Generally the lips that protrude, or the part that sticks out the most, generally would be on the lower lip. So the lower lip tends to have a highlight near the center of it, and we also tend to see the highlight here at the edge of the vermilion border and the philtrum. We see a highlight right here and at the philtral ridges. So let's just start shading. All right, so here we have upturned lips. So again, we see kind of this curve upwards at the corners. We see, you know, the highlights here, kind of a more prominent shadow underneath. But generally, upturned lips could vary anywhere in the size of the lips and the shape in the center. It's mostly seen just upwards here in the corners. So when we're working with full lips, when we start kind of creating the upper and lower lips, they're going to be a bit larger than what we've been doing earlier. And I find that generally full lips tend to extend outwards right to the corners of the mouth, unlike what we just did with the upturned lips. I also notice that generally the curve here at the bottom lip tends to be closer to the corners of the mouth, which helps make them look fuller as well. We might see less of a dip here in the Cupid's bow area, or we might still see a bit of a curve. So this kind of varies from person to person. And then in previous lips that we've drawn, we may have had kind of smaller upper lips that kind of went straight down, but in fuller lips, they tend to curve outwards just a little bit more. So that's going to make them kind of have a little bit more of a pucker to them. And generally with fuller lips, we're going to see more highlights throughout because they are kind of protruding further than smaller lips. So as we're shading, we'll see more shadow kind of in the center area still, but less in the larger areas of the lip. All right, so here we have full lips. You'll notice that generally where they tend to curve outwards is closer to the edges of the mouth, and they tend to bow outwards with that curve, and that gives them kind of a more voluminous appearance. All right, let's move on. The next type of lip shape that we are going to draw is a thin lip, or we could even call it like a shelf lip, where the upper lip kind of hangs over the lower lip just a little bit more. So when we are working with the thinner lips, we'll still have kind of the similar center shape. But what's different is that the upper and lower lips are going to be quite a bit smaller. So in this case, since the upper lip is kind of hanging over the lower lip more, we're going to see less of the lower lip, and it's going to be more in shadow once we get there. So generally thin lips don't have quite as many curves to them. They generally sit much closer to the center of the lips, so we're not going to see as much difference between them here. Okay, so when I do this, I'm actually going to really lighten up this line before I start shading. Because the lips are so thin, there's not like a super defined edge to them. They're kind of blended more. So that vermilion border is not always a really hard edge. So just depending on the lips you're drawing, some might have a harder edge, some might not. Some might have kind of a darker border, whereas others it might be more highlighted. So in this case, because the upper lid or upper lip is kind of hanging over the lower lip more, most of this is going to be more shadowed. All right, so when we see the thin lips, notice how close the upper and lower lip are to the center. There's a bit more shadowing if the upper lip is overhanging the lower lip just a little bit, and if that's the case, we'd also call them a shelf lip. The next style of lip that we're going to look at is a double lobe upper lip. So the lobes would be like those tubes sort of that we're creating on the lips. So when we see a double lobe, I'm just going to kind of start with this simple line across. I'm going to draw the bottom lip first because it's just going to be kind of a simple curve. And we'll go back to the middle again. So the double lobe tends to give you slightly fuller lips, but the key is right in the center here. So instead of the lip kind of protruding downwards, it's actually going to be protruding upwards a little bit. So it gives you that look like your mouth is always kind of slightly open, just a little bit. So by double lobe, we mean like here and here. So that's two lobes, and they kind of come together to meet in the middle. So it's just kind of a different central shape that we're working with. The curve is kind of moving in a different direction. All right, so here we have an example of a double lobe on the upper lip. And now we're going to move on to our last shape of lips, which would be the double lobe on the lower lip. All right, our last lip shape that we're going to look at is a double lobe on the lower lip. So just like the upper lip, we're going to see those sort of tubular shapes more pronounced on the lower lip this time. So in this case, we could see kind of that more open mouth look. Otherwise, another thing we might see is more of this sort of downturned kind of curve here. And then the main thing we're going to focus on is we're kind of going to see almost like a reverse Cupid's bow on the lower lip. So there's going to be a little bit more shape to it. It's not just a curve, it's a double curve. So this could be subtle, it could be very exaggerated, and the upper lip could be pretty big or small. This is varying depending on the person, definitely. Because of this more defined curve at the lower lip, we're going to see a bit more shadow here under where the chin kind of curves in before it meets the lip. All right, so here we have the double lobe on the lower lip. And so we can see that there's more of a defined curve at the bottom instead of in the center. So we see more of these tubular shapes on the sides. So there you have it. There's 6 different lip shapes. Thanks for watching and keep creating.